They thought they were safe. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, thousands of soldiers. But when the sky suddenly roared with fire, entire ships were torn apart like paper. Ordinary B-25 bombers had become ship-killing monsters. Unlike anything Japan had ever seen, the sea boiled with fire and steel. Thick black smoke rose into the sky as men screamed from shattered decks, their voices swallowed by the roar of engines and the thunder of explosions. In a matter of minutes, what had once been a proud convoy of Japanese transports and destroyers turned into drifting carcasses of steel, their blood spilling into the waters of the Bismarck Sea. Sailors clung to the wreckage, eyes wide in disbelief, while glowing traces sliced through the horizon, every burst ending in destruction. It was supposed to be a safe crossing. 8 transports carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers of the 51st Division, escorted by destroyers armed with anti-aircraft guns, moved forward with total confidence in the Imperial Navy. They believed the Americans couldn't touch them. High-altitude bombers had failed time and again. Torpedo attacks were predicted and repelled. Convoys had crossed that route before, without incident. For the Japanese commanders on the bridge, the sea belonged to them. But then came a sound. A low, unnatural rumble rising from the ocean itself. What first seemed like a normal bombing run revealed its true nature only as it drew closer. From the noses of the aircraft, rows of dark barrels appeared. 8 machine guns ready to speak with fire. Within seconds, the sky exploded into glowing lines of death, tearing through steel, cutting down men, turning order into chaos. Ships trained for years to repel traditional air attacks suddenly found themselves helpless before something completely new, something no doctrine had ever prepared them for. In less than 15 minutes, the fate of an entire division, the faith of a navy, and the myth of Japanese invincibility were shattered. But to understand how this nightmare began, we must go back to the moment when American mechanics in a dusty hangar dared to defy tradition and created a weapon no one had ever imagined. At the beginning of 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a turning point. Japan, once triumphant across vast oceans, was now struggling to hold on to its conquests. The Allied advance through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea threatened the outer defensive ring of the empire. The survival of entire garrisons depended on supplies carried across treacherous waters. In Lae, on the northern coast of New Guinea, thousands of Japanese soldiers waited desperately for reinforcements. Ammunition was running out. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Without fresh troops, the Japanese line would collapse, opening the way for Allied forces to advance unopposed. To answer this desperate need, the Imperial Navy assembled a powerful convoy. 8 transports carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers of the 51st Division, escorted by 8 destroyers. This was no routine mission. It was a lifeline. Japanese commanders believed the odds were in their favor. Their doctrine, shaped by decades of naval tradition, taught that disciplined convoys, protected by anti-aircraft guns and fighter patrols, could withstand any aerial attack. The warships formed a living wall of steel. Their gunners had trained tirelessly to unleash storms of fire against enemy planes. They had seen American attacks before. High-altitude bombers dropping bombs with poor accuracy, torpedo planes forced into long, vulnerable approaches. Time and again, the steel umbrella had held firm. Their confidence ran deep, and that confidence was built on experience. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft had struck with devastating precision. In the Java Sea, Imperial forces had annihilated Allied fleets. The Navy had every reason to believe its doctrine was solid and its ships invincible. Officers taught their sailors that no bomber could truly threaten a moving convoy if the gunners stayed calm and the maneuvers were precise. Every sailor believed in those lessons carved into their minds. Aim steady, fire without hesitation, and the enemy would be swept from the sky. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. The United States Army Air Forces had learned painful lessons. High-altitude bombings against ships had failed. Torpedoes were scarce, and their delivery far too risky. Something had to change. Across scattered workshops in Australia, a new idea began to take shape, one that defied convention and ignored established doctrine. A transformation was approaching, unseen by Japanese eyes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with a fury no sailor could imagine. The birth of the B-25 strafer did not begin in a factory, nor in the polished halls of strategy, but in the dusty heat of an Australian airfield. There, among improvised tools and the urgency of war, an American officer named Paul "Pappy" Gunn dared to challenge the limits of tradition. A former Navy pilot turned Air Force innovator, Gunn had witnessed enough failures to know that something drastic had to be done. High-altitude bombings against ships were nearly useless. Torpedoes demanded resources and skills the U.S. Air Force simply did not have in the Southwest Pacific. If Japan's vital arteries were to be cut, the answer had to come not from tradition, but from ingenuity. Gunn's vision was simple but radical. Transform the medium bomber, the B-25 Mitchell, into a direct attack aircraft, a flying fortress of fire. At Eagle Farm near Brisbane, he and a small group of mechanics stripped away the glass nose of the bomber. In its place, they bolted steel mounts, ammunition belts, and the heavy barrels of Browning .50 caliber machine guns. At first, there were 4, soon 8. 8 mouths of fire pointing straight ahead, ready to unleash a storm of destruction. It was an experiment born from sweat and improvisation, reinforcing the nose to endure recoil, balancing the ammunition loads, preventing jams during violent dives. Each challenge was met with trial, error, and pure determination. The weapon they created was monstrous. Each .50 caliber fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Together, the 8 guns could spit nearly 7,000 rounds in a single minute, enough to tear through steel superstructures, silence anti-aircraft gunners, and turn a ship's deck into a slaughterhouse before a single bomb was dropped. The sailors who later faced these modified Mitchells described the sight as terrifying, 8 flashes bursting from the nose, as if the aircraft itself had become a demon breathing fire. But firepower alone was not enough. Gunn's innovation was soon joined by another desperate invention: skip bombing. American pilots, guided by Major William Benn of the 43rd Bomb Group, trained for weeks against the rusting hull of the SS Pruth, learning to drop bombs at wave-top height. So they would skip across the water and hit ships right at the waterline. It demanded nerves of steel. Pilots had to fly straight toward the target, low and exposed, while tracer bullets slashed through the air around their cockpits. And yet, the accuracy was astonishing. The bombs skipped like stones, striking with brutal precision where high-altitude bombings had always failed. When General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, witnessed this combination, he immediately understood its potential. Machine gun barrages to sweep the decks clean, skip bombs to rip open the hulls. Together, they transformed the B-25 into what Kenney called a convoy destroyer, a machine capable of annihilating fleets in mere minutes. By early 1943, entire squadrons were being converted, their noses armed with machine guns, their crews training endlessly for the mission that loomed ahead. What emerged from those hangars was more than just a modification. It was a revolution. A bomber reborn as a predator, a weapon that broke every rule of doctrine and promised to redefine the balance of power in the Pacific. And soon, over the waters of New Guinea, the Imperial Japanese Navy would discover what this innovation truly meant. The convoy glided through the waters of the Bismarck Sea, beneath a pale morning sky. On the decks of 8 transport ships, the soldiers of Japan's 51st Division leaned against the rails, smoking, speaking in low voices, unaware of the doom drawing ever closer. They carried rifles, bayonets, and dreams of reinforcing their comrades at Leh. Some wrote letters that would never be delivered. Others gazed at the endless horizon, trusting the Imperial Navy to keep them safe. Around them, 8 sleek destroyers cut through the waves, their engines humming, their crews alert and confident. For a full year, Japanese ships had crossed these seas unopposed. There was no reason to expect anything different now. Aboard the destroyers, officers drilled their gunners constantly. The 25mm cannons were polished, the 5-inch guns loaded, the rangefinders ready. The doctrine was clear. If American bombers came, the umbrella of steel would rise. The sailors rehearsed their roles again and again, tracking invisible targets, believing that discipline and firepower would protect them. They had repelled attacks before. They would do it again. For Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commanding from his flagship, the mission was dangerous, yes, but not impossible. Meanwhile, far to the south, in airfields carved from the jungles of New Guinea, another scene was taking shape. American and Australian crews were preparing their Mitchells and bow fighters. Mechanics tightened gun mounts, checked ammunition belts, and wiped oil-stained hands on their worn uniforms. Pilots gathered in dim light, studying maps, tracing routes with calloused fingers. They knew what awaited them. Low-level raids through walls of fire, engines roaring just above the waves, and the very real chance of never coming back. Some stayed silent, staring at photographs tucked inside their flight jackets. Others cracked nervous jokes, hiding fear behind strained laughter. The air smelled of fuel and tension as ground crews loaded bombs with delayed fuses. The plan was simple, brutal, and untested on such a scale. The B-25 strafers would dive first, unleashing torrents of 50-caliber bullets to wipe out the anti-aircraft gunners. Then the skip bombs would follow, bouncing across the sea like deadly stones, slamming into the hulls with surgical precision. Timing was everything. Coordination meant survival. Failure meant disaster. At dawn, on March 3, 1943, the engines roared to life. Propellers bit into the humid air, kicking up dust and debris across the runway. Pilots of the 3rd Attack Group and their Australian comrades took off one by one, their planes bristling with guns and determination. Below, mechanics watched them fade into the clouds, knowing that many might never return. Out over the ocean, Japanese lookouts scanned the horizon. They expected high-altitude bombers, perhaps torpedo planes. They did not expect what was coming. Predators flying just above the waves, armed with 8 gun barrels each, soon to set the sea itself ablaze. The stage was set. 2 forces were closing in, destined for a collision that would leave one side shattered forever. The first Japanese lookout saw them just after dawn, dark specks on the southern horizon, moving in tight formation, just as American bombers always did. Alarms blared. Gun crews scrambled to their stations, swiveling their cannons skyward, eyes fixed on the heavens. At 7,000 feet, a formation of B-17s and B-25s appeared, exactly as expected. The Japanese breathed easier. They had trained for this. They had won before. Shells thundered into the sky, traces streaking upward in glowing arcs, a curtain of fire forming above the convoy. But then another sound emerged, a deep, unnatural roar rising from the sea itself. Pilots from the 3rd Attack Group and the Australian squadrons were flying just above the waves, their propellers whipping the water into spray, their noses gleaming with gun barrels. The B-25 strafers were invisible, until they were nearly upon the convoy. Japanese sailors froze, stunned. This was not the attack they expected. Major Edward Larner led the charge. His plane, ruthless, skimmed the surface at nearly 300 miles per hour. At barely 1,000 meters, he squeezed the trigger. 8 jets of fire burst from the nose, a wall of lead tearing through the air. The rounds ripped into the destroyer Shirayuki, shredding its bridge, slaughtering its gunners, tearing through steel and flesh alike. Glass shattered, structures crumpled. In less than 10 seconds, the Shirayuki fell silent, its guns dead, its command obliterated. Behind him, more B-25s dove upon the convoy. Lieutenant John Hanbury lined up on the transport Kyokusei Maru, his tracers walking from bow to stern, destroying the bridge, cutting down officers, and severing the ship's rudder. His bombs skipped across the waves, slamming into the hull and detonating deep inside, ripping the vessel open. Soldiers trapped on deck never had a chance. The sea swallowed their screams. Everywhere chaos reigned. Blue fighters swooped in, their 20-minute cannons roaring, raking gun nests, shattering lifeboats and cutting men down where they stood. Skip bombs skipped across the water like stones of death, striking transports with devastating impact. The destroyer Arashio tried to protect the convoy, turning to intercept, but sealed its fate. 3 B-25s converged, their combined fire annihilating the bridge, locking the rudder and driving it straight into the transport Nojima. The two ships collided, locked in a flaming embrace, fire leaping from hull to hull as ammunition erupted in rolling waves of thunder. From his flagship, Admiral Kimura watched the sea turn into hell. Signals crackled over the radio. Orders to maneuver, to counterattack, to resist. But the very sky had turned against him. The new American tactics defied every doctrine. No torpedo runs, no distant bombing. They came point blank. Guns blazing, skip bombs hammering like steel fists. The transport Oigawa Maru tried to maneuver, but its flank opened like a wound. 50 caliber bullets raked its decks. A bomb pierced the hull and struck its stores of fuel and ammunition. The explosion tore it apart. 1,000 soldiers vanished in an instant, consumed by fire and sea. 15 minutes. That was all it took. In 15 minutes, the proud Japanese convoy ceased to exist. Ships that had carried men and hope now drifted in pieces, burning, sliding across the waves. Survivors struggled in the water, clinging to debris, to lifeboats, to anything that floated. Above them, American planes circled one last time, strafing rafts, ensuring that no reinforcements would ever reach Leh. For the Japanese sailors and soldiers, this was not merely a defeat. It was annihilation. For the Allies, it was proof that courage and innovation could rewrite the rules of war. By noon, the waters of the Bismarck Sea were no longer blue. They were black, choked with oil, ash, and drifting bodies. The convoy that had departed with confidence was now nothing but smoldering wreckage. Of 8 transports, none remained. 4 destroyers had sunk, and the rest limped away, their decks littered with the dead. Nearly 7,000 men had set sail, hoping to reinforce Leh. Fewer than 1/200 would ever see land again. But the horror did not end with the sinking. Those who fought to survive in the water soon became targets again. Following direct orders, Allied pilots strafed lifeboats and swimmers, preventing any regrouping or rescue. Japanese sailors, clinging to debris, watched in terror as tracer rounds tore across the waves, shattering rafts, scattering men into red foam. It was ruthless, and it was effective. When the last American plane departed, the sea had become a grave. On the shattered decks of the few surviving destroyers, officers walked among the wreckage, searching for any sign of order. Bodies piled in corners, compartments torn open, equipment reduced to scrap. Admiral Kimura himself barely escaped. His flag no longer flew. The confidence that had once guided him lay in ruins. His convoy had been annihilated before his very eyes, and there was nothing he could do. Walsh's war did not end in Normandy. In August 1944, he took command of a larger unit, 400 men, to help liberate the ports of Brittany. He fought alongside Canadian forces in the fierce battle for Le Havre, once again under fire, once again advancing. But the cold, the humidity, and exhaustion took their toll. By the end of the year, illness forced him to return to the United States. In 1946, he retired from active service. In peacetime, he never sought glory. He taught science in a high school. He worked as a parole officer. He lived quietly in Maryland, far from the roar of cannons and the echoes of war. But when the Korean War began, the Navy called him once more for his rare knowledge and unshakable leadership. Quentin Walsh lived until the year 2000, passing away at the age of 90, one of the last living veterans of D-Day. Nearly 2 decades later, his name returned to the sea. In 2019, the United States Navy announced a new Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the USS Quentin Walsh, DDG-132. It was the first time in history that a Navy destroyer had been named after a Coast Guard officer. At the ceremony in Cherbourg, American and French officials gathered to honor the man whose bluff had freed the port and saved the city. They called him one of the most inspiring figures of the Normandy campaign. Today, his story reminds us of something greater, that victory is not always written in numbers or artillery fire. Sometimes it is written in courage, in nerves of steel, in the unbreakable spirit of a man who faced the impossible and never blinked. Commander Quentin R. Walsh, the Coast Guardsman who fought with a poker face and left a legacy forever engraved in the history of freedom.